Good evening. Welcome back to the Liminal Record. As always, grab a blanket, grab some popcorn. Let's get into tonight's stories. Tape recorder. My friend suggested I share my story here, and I finally have the time to type it out. I don't know if this exactly meets the standards of this outlet, but it is definitely the scariest experience I've ever had. Here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old, and I lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As now I'm 21 and I live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself, as my mother was out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province months at a time. So I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in. Usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since the crying was the last thing that I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction that the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind. Just nonstop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that only had a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time that I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder. One of the biggest I had ever seen, peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had gone all the way in expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home, and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran to my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I was also never able to go back into that forest again. A bed for the night. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit his family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter, and it was getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night and offered him a meal and a room at her house, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase, and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2. And by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry, and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, they said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called out to her, but she didn't answer, and he heard nothing else. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down, laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee, and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees where he began to fill under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where a pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. Nope, Great-Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He pulled the body out from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with a blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then toward the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move towards the bed. Then he heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the head with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then there was silence. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transfer trucks on it. John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what had happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance he would have been the one who got in trouble. He just thanked God and escaped, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. Old Men in the Woods. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages, following nothing but a map and a compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like I thought we would have time to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through the woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back up to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees either side. We were marching onward in silence, and at this point all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit, a red bow tie, and dress shoes. He looked late 70s, early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face, and a gray-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought, seeing a guy his age out here in those clothes in these weather conditions, was, this guy's lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry. He didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, and then suddenly became very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk and then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute or so, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so we continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down the slope that was probably a 40-degree angle, spanned for 50 feet or more, and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold on to or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering, how did he cross that so quickly? I mean, at that distance, it's hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he did not have any mud or water on him at all. My uncle and I looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and I was going to try and make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, that he needed our help, that his friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to the car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon. They would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling these words. his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his fists on his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and wait the police, so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them and packs of supplies, like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to that exact spot, and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction through the bushes that he led us. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. One of my weirdest experiences to date.